Welcome, I'm Dragon, and today I will be creating that sci-fi tunnel that you saw from the intro. So without any further ado, let's get into it. First, add a cylinder and change the vertexes to 7. Then rotate it 90 degrees, go into edit mode, select the faces on both, and delete them. Then go out of edit mode, add a modifier, the solidify modifier, and change the thickness to something that looks good for you. I personally use -21 meters. Now you can go and apply the modifier and go into edit mode and add one loop cut with Command R. And do the same thing for the middle of the cylinder and then select the faces and delete them. And now go select the vertexes and fill those faces again. Now scale it along the x-axis so it's a little wider. Now add another cylinder, change the vertexes to 32, change the radius so it's smaller, and the depth so it's also smaller. Now rotate it 90 degrees, and in edit mode, be sure you're in edit mode for this part, position it over on the side of the other cylinder, the first cylinder that we added. Now scale it along the y-axis so that it fits the original cylinder. Now add an array modifier and move them along the x and y axis until they're spaced out evenly, and then change the count to something that you prefer. I personally decide to use 7. And then you can add a mirror modifier. Now go into edit mode on the main sphere, go to the middle of it, and add a loop cut. Then you can select the vertexes on the one half of the side and delete those vertexes, and then replace it with a mirror modifier so that we only have to model half of it or add materials to half of it just to make it a little bit quicker and easier. Now go to the upper half of the same cylinder, add 2 loop cuts, apply those, and then add 3 more loop cuts on the opposite direction. And now you should have a grid of squares, 9 of them, so select each one, inset them with I, and then extrude them out. Then hit Command B or Control B if you're on Windows to create these bevels. Then just drag it far enough that it creates a dent in the actual wall, and creates this cool effect. Then make sure you've added a loop cut above the smaller cylinders, then select those 3 faces, add I, so to inset them, then unselect individual so that it's a solid one, and then do the extrude them outward and Command B or Control B on Windows to create that same cool beveled effect. Now we get to start on materials. So the first material is an emission shader on the bottom 3 squares. This emission shader is a blue that I decided looked good, along with changing the strength to a higher value. And if you want to preview it in Eevee just to see how bright it is, which is what I ended up doing, then be sure to turn on bloom. With those 3 squares still selected, duplicate them with Shift D and then hit P to select them into their own object. And with that new object selected, go into modifiers, add wireframe modifier, and increase the thickness of this wireframe. Then change the material to a black material. And now for the big rectangle beneath these squares. I did the exact same thing I did for the squares, other than I made the emission shader orange instead of blue, and I didn't have it as bright. Now I added a loop cut on the floor and moved it to the side to add a blue emission shader. And then for the rest of the floor, I added a checkerboard texture and made it black and white, and made the roughness very low so that it was very shiny. And then for the smaller cylinders, I did nothing other than lower the roughness to make them more shiny, because who doesn't like shiny? I then made a very simple material for the rest of the walls and ceiling by adding a Voronoi texture, a color ramp, and a bump, and applying that bump into the normal on the principal BSDF. This allowed me to have a cool texture that had cracks along the walls and everything, while being able to control how many cracks it is by changing the scale, or the color ramp bringing it forward and backward. So, like I said earlier, that simple texture is what I ended up applying to the walls and ceiling. So now everything's done other than making this a repeating loop. So to do this, you go Shift D, move it 1 over, or whatever your cylinder size is, and then Shift R to keep that repeating that action until you get it long enough that you can't see the end. At least that's what I did in my final render. For this example, it's not. And then you can take the camera, make sure the camera is at 0 everything, same with rotation, but then you can change the rotation along the x-axis to 90 degrees, and then you can animate it. So currently it's at 0, make that to -1, and then animate it 20 frames over to 1. From there, you'll have an endless loop that would just keep on repeating. But one thing to mention right now is currently it speeds up, slows down, and doesn't look that great. So to fix that, select those two keyframes that you already have selected, and when you do this with right click, then you can see that there's a handle type, change this to vector, and then that should look a lot better. It is kind of weird because your eye is still catching the keyframe, so that's why I bring that down, and then it looks a whole lot better. And if I change this to preview view, then you could see that it looks way better, other than there is still a glitch on the top of the ceiling, and this is only because it's in preview mode and you haven't rendered it. Once you rendered that, that should be fixed, and here's an example of a rendered preview. And one more thing to mention is that if you do have any textures that aren't lining up, say the checkerboard texture, then you can go change the scale and location and just make it so that it looks and lines up better. And with that, here's the cycles render. I hope you found this helpful or enjoyable, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Bye!